Thank you. I just came back from visiting my parents. They'd be very surprised to hear that my coming up would evoke so much applause. So if anyone videotaped this, talk to me afterwards. In all seriousness, thanks to all of you for being present tonight. You're joining us for the Dean's Colloquium, and it marks a most important moment in our school's history, in which we're launching a comprehensive spirituality studies program at the School of Theology and Ministry. I'd like to also extend a special welcome to our friends at Paulus Press, who have made available not only Tom's work, but there's another book you might want to look at called the Paulus Biblical Commentary. I know that's very shameless self-promotion, but there's a number of fine works that you might want to avail yourself of. Following 2 years of extensive preparations and standing ever committed to the scholarly and pastoral excellence that is at the heart of our mission, we are delighted to announce the 2020 opening of our Christian Spirituality Initiative. This is an initiative that recognizes the deep spiritual hungers so palpable in our time, in both our church and in our world, and aims to make the riches and the wisdom of the Christian spiritual tradition the more known and accessible to people. This is an initiative that seeks to contribute scholars to a significantly growing academic field, and one that aspires to prepare ministerial leaders in the best ways possible for substantive, spiritual, formative ways of accompaniment. We do this mindful of the need to commit ourselves as educators and leaders to a way of life in the Spirit in accord with Christian beliefs, values, and dispositions, recognizing that the life in the Spirit, as the Apostle Paul knew so well, remains a journey of transformation. I'm going to make a parenthesis. That Pauline idea was not mine. That was actually Colleen's help with talking points. I just wanted you to know that others, other than me, appreciate Paul's contribution here. In this initiative, we draw upon the resources of a very strong faculty across Bible, systematics, practical theology, history, and ethics, who together offer a wide array of courses yearly in spirituality. We do so as an international theological center, grounded in the Ignatian and Jesuit tradition, and serious about rigorous academic inquiry, interdisciplinary study, ecumenical dialogue, and the engagement between faith and culture and faith and history. Our Christian Spirituality Studies Initiative has 4 major components. First, we are opening full concentrations in spirituality studies in all of our advanced degrees, the Master of Theology, the Licentiate in Sacred Theology, and the Doctorate of Sacred Theology. Advanced degree students will study the Christian spiritual tradition in depth with an eye toward creative and constructive appropriation of it in ways that contribute significantly to the church, to the academy, and the world. Second, we're also initiating 3 new freestanding 18-credit certificate programs, one in the study of Christian spirituality, one specifically in Ignatian spirituality and Jesuit studies, and one in spiritual and pastoral care. These may be taken for professional and personal education and enrichment, or to enhance one's ministerial skills in Christian spirituality. Third, we stand committed to solid training and continuing education of spiritual directors and guides. To this end, we offer a postmaster certificate in spiritual formation built around the schedules of those already involved in full-time ministry, and a Master of Theology with a ministerial track focus in spiritual direction. And finally, grounded in the spirituality of Ignatius of Loyola and seeking to prepare leaders formed in this rich tradition, we are beginning an intensive study of and training in the spiritual exercises in daily life, known as the 19th Annotation Retreat. This program will be open to trained spiritual directors who have experienced the 19th Annotation themselves. Energized and excited about this new direction and about the possibilities for continued growth and expansion that it promises, we seek to stand as an outstanding center of learning for Christian spirituality studies. And I'd like to invite your participation with us in this endeavor, in whatever ways you're most drawn. Thank you for marking this new chapter in the story of the STM with us. And at this point, I'd like to present to you the Faculty Director of Spiritual Studies at the STM, and in large part the driving force behind these initiatives, my friend and colleague, Colleen Griffith.
Thanks, Tom. And I have to say that the passion and care and wisdom that Tom has led with has really brought us to this night. So he's always very gracious in his comments to others in terms of their work, but we owe a great deal to Tom Stegman in terms of his leadership. So many of our faculty contribute courses to our spirituality initiative, but I'd like to especially acknowledge tonight the core spirituality faculty for our spirituality programming, who will carry the bulk of the coursework involved. Colleagues, when I call your name, please stand and remain standing until you all have been identified. And I'm going to be calling you in alphabetical order. So we begin with Professor André Bruyette, S.J., who specializes in 16th and 17th century spiritual theology, the Carmelite tradition, particularly Teresa of Avila, Ignatian spirituality, and the theology and spirituality of pilgrimage. Professor Francine Cardman, who is not with us tonight as she is out of state today, teaches and writes in the area of historical theology with specialization in the early Christian period. Professor Bart Gager, S.J., focuses on Ignatian spirituality and related Jesuit studies, and the ancient old Christian practice of discernment. Professor Angela Harkins, professor of New Testament, specializes in Second Temple Judaism and early Christianity, with strong interests in religious experience, prayer and hymnody, emotion studies, and gender studies. Professor Kathy Mooney specializes in medieval history and spirituality, with focus on saints and sanctity, prayer and mysticism. Professor Andrew Prevost works at the intersection of systematics and spirituality studies, with strong focus on spiritual classic texts and theologies of prayer. Professor Brian Robinette, not here tonight because he is celebrating his wife's birthday, works at the intersection of systematics and mysticism, with strong interest in the doctrine of God, the mystical turn in theology, and contemplative studies. Professor Michael Simoni is professor of sacred scripture, S.J., who works in biblical spirituality with keen interest in the Psalter and in wisdom literature. I myself teach in the area of theological anthropology and spirituality, with strong interest in classic spiritual texts, the relationship between spirituality and justice, and theologies and spiritualities of the body. Please give a round of applause to our core faculty. Thank you. I also wish to acknowledge tonight Lisa Hastings, who is here from the Office of Jesuit Spirituality, the Northeast Province Office, who is the Director of Spiritual Direction Initiatives for the province. Lisa will be coordinating our training and facilitating the 19th annotation. Lisa, would you stand? And please feel free during the reception period following our lecture tonight to chat with any of these core faculty members about areas in spirituality studies you might be interested in and some of our programming here. And before you leave tonight, be sure to take a bookmark with you, which will direct you to the website that will detail these programs. And so on now with our keynote address.
Which I'm not giving, but there's no coups in this school. I have the pleasure of introducing our distinguished speaker tonight. Dr. Thomas Groome is a professor of theology and religious education at Boston College's School of Theology and Ministry. He's the former director of Boston College's Church in the 21st Century Center, and for many years has directed the university's PhD in theology and education. Tom was born and grew up in County Kildare, Ireland. It's a country you may have heard of. He'll probably tell you more about it. He's the youngest of 10 children. He holds a Master of Arts in Religious Education from Fordham University and a doctorate in Theology and Education from Columbia University and Union Theological Seminary in New York. For many years, he was the senior faculty person and then director of Boston College's world-renowned Institute of Religious Education and Pastoral Ministry, now a department within the School of Theology and Ministry, which he's also served as chair. Tom is an award-winning author, having written or edited some 10 books, over 200 essays, 2 grade school religion curricula, and he is the principal creator of the Credo series, a high school theology curriculum published by Veritas Benziger. His best-known major works are Christian Religious Education, 1980, Sharing Faith, 1991, Educating for Life, 2001, What Makes Us Catholic, 2003, Will There Be Faith, 2011, and most recently, Faith for the Heart, published by Paulus Press this year, and copies are available at the table at the entrance. A world-renowned scholar of religious education, Tom has lectured widely and repeatedly throughout the United States and the world, including Australia, Canada, Ireland, England, Scotland, Korea, New Zealand, the Caribbean, Trinidad, Taiwan, Hong Kong, China, Pakistan, Jamaica, Lithuania, Sweden, Norway, Peru, Ecuador, Germany, Holland, South Africa, and Malta. Like Johnny Cash, he's been everywhere, man. He has appeared on many local and national TV channels and radio programs and is frequently quoted in the press. Tom has received many awards, including Master Teacher of the Year from Boston College's School of Arts and Sciences. He describes his lifelong work as encouraging people to, quote, bring their lives to faith and their faith to life. It's my privilege and honor to introduce to you tonight's keynote speaker, Dr. Tom Groome.
Well, I am honored. Really, Tom, you're very gracious, and I'm honored by the invitation. I'm honored by the occasion. I'm daunted by it. I said to Bart Gager in the bathroom, this is singing for the singers, you know, our prophets not being welcome in their home country. But I think I'm just going to take it as a kind of a home game and hope that it's a friendly crowd, as I think it probably is. It's a great honor. It's a great opportunity, I think, for our school to be forwarding and fronting our spirituality resources and commitment. In many ways, it's what I understand our school to be about, our School of Theology and Ministry, to be teaching theology and scriptures and our beloved tradition in ways that equip people to go out into the world and to mentor the spiritual lives of people, to indeed invite people to holiness and wholeness of life, and to be a resource. In other words, enabling people to take their faith and put it to work in the midst of the world. And in many ways, so in a sense, our spiritual purpose is what defines the school and what should define the school. So it's marvelous, this new initiative, and I'm happy to be a part of it, and indeed privileged to be able to speak at this particular moment. When I stop and think about it, and especially as I heard as Dr. Griffith introduce our distinguished faculty, I was saying to myself, God, every one of these would be more qualified to give this talk than I would. However, I had the good fortune of writing an ideal book for the occasion. And I think they said, well, why don't we give a little time to Tom's book? And in a sense, it is the fruit of many years of spiritual reflection and questing and researching and thinking and talking. My emphasis, of course, is always as a religious educator, is not so much on the theory of spirituality, as rather than how do we nurture the spiritual lives of people. What's the best way of going about spiritual nurture and bringing their faith to be a living faith, to be a faith that's alive and lived and life-giving for themselves and for the life of the world? So in a sense, It is an opportune book, and I'm going to say a little bit about it. Tom's reference to me as a world-renowned religious educator, though, does prompt me to tell a humbling question, a humbling tale, as it were, a humbling story. I don't do much traveling anymore. I did for many years, as Tom indicated with that list of places I've been. I do leave for Hong Kong next Friday, but anyway, and after that for Shanghai. But I don't travel much anymore. But when I do travel, I often say to people, put me in a local inn or in a bed and breakfast, because as long as it's safe and clean, that's my preference. Because a Marriott is a Marriott is a Marriott. And then whether it's Chicago, New York, Los Angeles, it's still a Marriott. And sure enough, people have been doing that. Well, a little while ago, I went into a diocese called Homo Thibodeau, Louisiana. It's way out to the west of New Orleans. I almost said New Orleans. New Orleans. About 100 miles west of New Orleans, out in the bayous. And the person who picked me up at the airport, I told them to put me in a nice inn. She was a sister and the director of religious education for the diocese. So we're on our way out into the bayous on a winter's night, and she said, "Oh, Professor, you're going to love the place you're staying. We've booked you in this marvelous old inn." And I said, "Oh, that's marvelous. Thank you, sister." And yeah, she says, "The people come from all over America to stay in this inn." And I said, "Oh, that's marvelous. That's wonderful." So we drove along. I said to myself, now I wonder why they all come from all over America. So I said, "Sister, why do people come from all over America to stay at this inn?" "Oh," she says, "it's haunted." I said, "Oh, it's haunted, yeah." "Yeah," she says, "the poltergeist fellows, they have their monthly meeting there every month." She says, "Yeah." And in fact, she says, this is a true story. She said, the room you're staying in has a freestanding wooden hand basin. And they say that during the night that it sometimes actually moves across the floor. And I said, "Oh, now." Well, by the time we get to the inn, I'm in a cold sweat. I say to her, "Sister, is there a Marriott around here anywhere?" She said, "Professor, but you're this famous religious educator. You don't believe that stuff, do you?" I said, "Of course I believe that stuff. I'm Irish, for God's sake. I'm Irish long before I'm a famous religious educator." So she took me to a Marriott, and I slept well for the night. But I wouldn't have slept a wink all night. I'd be sitting up waiting for the thing to go across the floor. Let's get on with the job. When I started working in the whole area, and the subtitle will explain also, the subtitle, I'll get to that in a moment, and by the way, starting with definitions is not a very enticing way to begin a presentation, but I think we have to clear the air a little bit around with definitions of what we mean by spirituality, and all of the varied competencies that you heard referred to in our faculty's background and so on. It gives you the sense that it is an enormous field of study. It's a great field of operation. And it's also a practice, that spirituality has to be practices that we have. Now, the practices, I don't think, amount to our spirituality. They don't equate with our spirituality. That the practices, in a sense, are to nurture our spirituality, to sustain our spirituality, and especially toward lived faith. Years ago in an old Irish seminary, I remember having a spiritual director that we had to go see every once a month. And the opening question he'd always ask us was, "How's your prayer life?" And I remember thinking, even at the time as a very young person, that's not the right question to be asking me, Father. I want him to ask me about my life rather than about just my prayer life. Now, my prayer life, the purpose of my prayer life is to sustain my spirituality, but we can't equate our spiritual practices with our spirituality. Our spirituality, in a sense, is our whole way of being in the world. It's our whole, with a transcendent relationship with God and how we live into the faith that we profess. So I found myself at the beginning of the book needing to do some definitions. Now, this is not a very popular way to begin, but in a sense, it may be slightly helpful and maybe to clarify a little bit. When you go to the literature, it's confusing, but of course, when you go to Amazon, it's terribly confusing. Just for fun, I put spirituality. I brought up Amazon this morning. I put in spirituality into the search engine, and of the first 3 books that came out, every one of them, in some way or other, was about the self. about becoming an authentic self, about becoming a healthy self, upon drawing upon one's own self-resources and so on. But it was spirituality with a small s. There was no sense of a capital S spirituality, of an ultimate, a transcendent ground, of an ultimate horizon, as Rahner would say, that lures us, that draws us, that reaches out to us, that takes the initiative, that empowers our response, what we mean by God's grace. And so it was a very impoverished. Now, the care for the self is a very authentic aspect of spirituality. And yet, in Christian terms at least, and I'm speaking out of a Catholic Christian perspective, obviously, but indeed it's the care for the self, but then it's to love the neighbor as oneself. And then there's this whole sense we have of a transcendent realm, that God that reaches out to us, that takes the initiative, that loves us first before we love God, and then invites us to respond and empowers our response as well, what we mean by grace. And that God's grace is indeed the source of our spiritual nurture. God's grace comes to us to enable our response, but it does require in a sense, it heightens our responsibility, God's initiative and love at work in our lives, and so on. So capturing some of that in a pithy definition wasn't easy, but I gave it a go. Let me see if it might be helpful. I begin by talking about spirituality in general as a people's sense of relationality with a transcendent ground of being, and then how this relationship shapes how we live our daily lives. That it has to reach into our daily lives. Otherwise, it's some kind of esoteric, perhaps it's a philosophy of life, but it's not a spirituality. Then Christian spirituality in particular, I talk about it as a people's embrace of relationality with the one and triune God of love as the foundation of their being, and then empowered by the Holy Spirit to realize this relationship by living as disciples of Jesus. And I suppose I want that to be the punchline, that spirituality ultimately is about coming to live as disciples of Jesus. And what helps us, what sustains us, what encourages us and inspires us to do that. And then I think we always have to emphasize, this by way of Christian spirituality, that is within the context of a community of disciples. That it's not a solo flight by any means. And that the purpose of that living as Jesus' spirituality, or as disciples of Jesus, is to live for the reign of God, which of course was the purpose of Jesus' life in the midst of time and place. I don't know if that's helpful, but in a sense, Christian spirituality, I believe, is to be realized as a living faith. And by a living faith, I mean a faith that's alive, that's vibrant, that's indeed gushing up to eternal life, as from his conversation with the Samaritan woman. It has to be lived. It's not the one who says, Lord, Lord, who enters the reign of God, but the one who does the will of my Father, that living of our faith. And it has to be life-giving for ourselves and for others and for the life of the world. Then I talk about Christian spirituality when we refer to it as a habitus. I use that old term from Aquinas. It's a modus operandi that we have, in a sense. And then it refers to all of the stories and the symbols, the perspectives and the practices, the prayers and the patterns that, graced by the Holy Spirit, nurtures people to live as disciples of Jesus for God's reign in the world. So we need our spiritual practices, in a sense, to realize and sustain our spirituality, but I do try to distinguish them. Very often I use the word interchangeably. But one of the things I've become tremendously convinced of is that we have an enormously rich treasury of spiritual charism, spiritual practices, and especially for our postmodern world. And perhaps it's our greatest asset, in a sense, at this point in time, is our spirituality. In many ways, Catholicism, or Catholic faith, yes, of course, it's a religion, it's a church, it's a tradition, but ultimately, I think at its heart, at its best, it's a great spirituality for life. And yet so seldom do we foreground that or present it that way, or when we do, it's misheard. And I think there's a particular need, especially in our postmodern and to our young people, to enable them to see that clearly, that it's an enormously life-giving, rich, extraordinary spirituality for life that can indeed enable them to live life well and holy and wholesome, and indeed love the neighbor as the self, and all the other things that the tradition will call them to do. I was in a centre recently down in the south of Ireland in New Ross. It was the Kennedy Summer School, where the Kennedy family came originally from New Ross. And they have this great summer school. And we were put up in this centre. It was spa of a sort, and but it was also a spirituality center. The irony was the Archbishop of Armagh was one of my fellow guests and the Primate of Ireland. But as we walked around together, all of the symbols were of Buddhas, of mandalas, of all kinds of paraphernalia, spiritual paraphernalia. And there wasn't a single Christian symbol among them all. And I said to the owner, who claimed to be a practicing Catholic, at least that's what he told me, I said, there isn't a Christian symbol any place. Why wouldn't we be drawing upon the richness of our own tradition? It was almost like news to him that yeah, maybe we don't need to go up to India and the Far and Asia, which are wonderful traditions. I'm not in any way disparaging them at all. But I think we have a tremendous resource in our own backyard. And so often then I think we underrate it, don't promote it. But thank goodness our STM is certainly going to do that. Then I'm trying to explain the title of the book. The title of the book is Faith for the Heart, and then a Catholic Spirituality. Let me say this very briefly. Catholic, in quote, simply says that it comes out of the treasury of Catholic faith, and yet I tried to write it in such a way that anyone can access its spiritual wisdom and indeed benefit from it. It's for the heart. Now, this is going to be a bit of a sweeping claim. Faith for the heart. And now this, as I said, I recognize this as an exaggeration, but in many ways for the first 1,000 years, I think the Christian faith, we appealed primarily to the heart, to human desire. And of course, Augustine was the epitome of that our hearts are restless until they rest in God. Now again, exaggerating, and yet I think making a valid point. In many ways, the second 1,000 years, our primary appeal was to people's reason, with Aquinas the epitome of that. Now both are needed, of course, the monastic and the scholastic. But I think that at least for our postmodern people, for the people who declare themselves as none, our young people who say they're spiritual but not religious, and on, I think we have to re-engage, at least to initially get their attention and to entice either anew or as new. I think beginning with the heart is more likely. However, I don't want to fall back into a heart and head type of dichotomy. And I say it very deliberately at the beginning that by heart, I'm using it in the biblical sense, the lave or the variations of that word, or in Hebrew, or cardia, of course, in Greek. That it's the core of the person, but it's not just the emotions. In the biblical sense, it also includes the conscience and the intellect as well. Coming back to my point about nurturing, how do we go about nurturing a holistic and a living faith? What was the appropriate pedagogy? And by pedagogy, I don't mean teaching techniques or methods. I mean a whole approach. How will we go about nurturing the spirituality of people in today's postmodern world? What's the best way to go about that? Which, as I said, is much more obviously my own question that I've been passionate about all my life. The kind of the how-to, and it isn't at all to minimize the importance of the systematic theological or the historical theological understanding of spirituality. But I suppose my passion and alleged insight or expertise is at the area of how do we nurture it? And I think we have a powerful clue in the praxis, the historical practices of Jesus. And I want to spend the rest of our time reflecting on this road to Emmaus. And I just want to begin here because in a sense it reflects his whole approach throughout his whole public ministry. And I'll say a little bit more about that in a few minutes. But it's an extraordinary example of mentoring, of spiritual mentoring, of these two poor, lost and distraught disciples stumbling out of Jerusalem on that Easter Sunday morning. But I want to begin and engage you with Luke 24, chapter 32, or verse 32, because as the two disciples, as they reflect back, in a sense, they stop and they look at each other and said, what did he do? What did he do to us? And then later we'll reflect on how did he do it. But they said to each other, were not our hearts burning within us? And I suppose that's what I'm trying to propose, that we need to find ways to encourage people's hearts to be burning, to set them on fire. While he was talking with us, and I'll come back to that, he wasn't talking at them. He wasn't being didactic. He was talking with them. He was in conversation, very, very clear. He was in conversation with them. He was a powerful resource for them, but he was talking with them on the road and opening the scriptures, not just explaining them, but in a sense open. And that verb there is the same one that is used when it says that with that their eyes were opened, 2 or 3 verses prior. When their eyes were opened, it's the same verb. He was helping them to open their eyes and to see for themselves when he was opening the scriptures to us. In other words, if you look at the pedagogy that's there, and you'll see it amplified in the full text in a little while, but he was talking with them. He was engaging their lives. He was getting them to name. My mentor, one of my great mentors in life, I was privileged to work with and so on and write about, was Paulo Freire. And Freire says, get people to name. Begin by getting people to name their own reality, to speak their own word. Don't name it for them or presume that you know how to name it for them, but get them to name their own realidad, as Freire would say, to name their own traumatic story, their own shattered vision. They were hoping. He was the one who was set Israel free. He gets them to name and reflect upon their own story and vision before he begins to introduce them to the story and vision of the faith community with Moses and all the prophets, all the passages that referred to himself and explaining that the Messiah had to suffer so as to enter into his glory. So in a sense, he takes the faith tradition and literally puts it on the table in front of them, but then invites them to see for themselves, never tells them what to see. It's extraordinary. I mean, if I was the risen Christ, I think I'd have jumped out and said, hey, look, I've come back, I've bounced back, but never walks with them, accompanies them, but never tells them, but gives them the resources, their own resources from their own life in the world and their traumatic experience, the resources of the scriptures and the tradition, and yet enables them to come to see for themselves. And so in a sense, for a spiritual nurture, there's something about engaging people's hearts, engaging their lives, engaging their own stories, that's imperative. To access then with the best of good scholarship, so this is not either or at all, accessing the spiritual wisdom of Christian faith, giving people ready access, persuasive access, and yet not just the didactic type of pontificating access, and then enabling people to see for themselves, and always toward a living faith, a faith that's alive, that's lived, that's life-giving. Now, if I was to practice a little of what I'm preaching, I would obviously, at this point, at least for the next 3 to 4 minutes, engage you in some such dynamic. Let me give it a go. Pause for a moment, and as you look into your own good heart tonight, what would you recognize fairly obviously and immediately as some of its most pressing hungers, the deepest hungers of your own heart? How would you name maybe the deepest one of all, at least in this moment? Maybe there's a particular story, example that comes to mind. And as you turn to the scriptures, the traditions of your Christian faith, what would come to greet you out of those rich resources by way of at least help beginning to satisfy? It'll always be partial. Taylor's great point that all of the fulfillments of all of our desires this side of eternity will always be only partial. And yet there'll also be a promise of their complete fulfillment in what Taylor calls time out of time, in eternity. But even partially, what's the resource of your faith that you bring to bear upon the hunger that lends a sense of hope, of possibility, and maybe some partial satisfaction? Can I invite you for about 2 minutes to say hello to your neighbor? If you don't like talking to your neighbor, don't bother, okay? the neighbor, but the neighbor will want to talk to you. It's inevitable. They always want to say something. Give it a little moment, and if you don't feel comfortable articulating the desire that occurred to you, then, as I said, turn to the neighbor and see if the neighbor perhaps recognize a desire they're willing to share. We do this just for about 2 minutes, maybe 3. Give it a go. See what the neighbor is thinking or feeling. Say hello first to the neighbor, and off we go. Let me just delve a little, and I will invite some of the reflections, insights that emerged a little while. About 10 minutes from now, we'll be back with your neighbor again, and then after that, we'll take some comments from the whole community. I'm just going to walk through the table of contents and make some points, because in a sense, just to highlight a little of what is there, and I'll only make a couple of points. One of the things I try to do, if you get through chapter 1, you'll read the rest of the book. Chapter 1 is difficult because I'm trying to make the argument that maybe we're in a new moment for faith. There's something very fascinating going on with the postmodern authors. Modernity, in many ways, just presumed that faith would get sucked out of society, that it would simply be abstracted out and would blow away, that eventually we'd all, after a little bit of enlightenment, when you got a bit of education, we would assume that this was just the superstition of our grandparents and we would get rid of it. And when you look at the architects of modernity, Marx, Nietzsche, Feuerbach, Freud, they were all non-believers. Now there's something fascinating going on in postmodernity where there seems to be a far greater openness to faith. And even people coming to recognize the need for faith and for spiritual grounding in ways that we haven't heard from the great architects and the great thinkers of our time in a long, long time. And so you have people, and many of the architects of postmodernity now are believers. And you think of people like Levinas and Kristeva and Ricoeur, of course, Gadamer, and even Habermas, a great old German philosopher that I read seriously one time, and then I gave up reading him because he was such a relentless atheist and neo-Marxist and radical and so on. Now he's saying that no, society really can't function very well without some kind of a grounding that is beyond the philosophical, something of faith, a reasoned faith, a spirituality to ground, a public ethic. And it's very difficult to maintain a public ethic without some kind of spiritual resource to sustain it. When you look into our public realm at the moment and the lack of so many highly educated people with apparently very little moral compass, you have to say, well, what's missing? And it's the title of a set of essays that Habermas had just recently published. What's missing? And they're beginning to realize, even in very secularized societies like France and Germany and the Scandinavian countries, that maybe there's something we're missing and that we have to return. That you've Francois Jullien, the great French philosopher, saying that the European Union may fall apart. Why? Because it has lost its original mooring. It has lost its original grounding in the kind of Christian personalism of Mounier and these authors in the aftermath of the 2 world wars, that the architects of the European Union were deeply grounded in Christian personalism. And that if you lose that, then why should they get together and work together? Why can't the radical right take over? Why can't the radical left take over? So it's an interesting shift in the literature that begins to, and even our students here who will, very many of them will recognize, say, well, I'm spiritual but not religious. But it's a healthy sign. It's a sign of hope, I think, that they're recognizing their own innate spiritual nature, that we're made in the image and likeness of God, that the breath we breathe is the breath of God, Genesis 2, verse 7. And so it's innate to us, this to be spiritual beings. So there is a certain recognition of that going on that we haven't seen, that the postmodern authors are trying to say, and the modernity is not. So that's one of the things I try to do. Don't do it probably very persuasively, but it's a fascinating thing to try to recognize. The second thing I try to do is, and it's in chapters 3, 4, and 5 especially, is to forefront, and through all of the chapters, to forefront and foreground the historical Jesus. And I want to say something about that because I think for Catholic spirituality, I would say that the greatest lacuna in our spirituality, in popular spirituality, There was a lacuna around the historical Jesus. The Christ of faith, the Son of God, the second person of the Blessed Trinity, and so on. Indeed, that was central to our faith and to our recognizing of our faith and living of our faith. But that carpenter from Nazareth, I mean, we weren't part. The early searches for the historical Jesus were all, as I understand it, mostly Protestant scholars and many scholars who were demythologizing the Scriptures. It's amazing now that so many of the great New Testament scholars now, Crossan and Lofink and Pagola and help me, Tom. There's other great names. Myers are all Catholic. And I think it's our time for reclaiming the historical Jesus. Now, it'll take me way too long. I'd say a little about in the book about why is this necessary? Because I think we in many ways as Catholics, the historical Jesus was not at the center and core of our faith. And some of that was the old catechesis. All of the old catechisms were based on the Catechism of the Council of Trent. And so the Maynooth Catechism, the Baltimore Catechism, and so on. They all base their doctrinal presentation of our faith on the Apostles' Creed. Seemed like a wise decision. But so they take each article of the Creed and then catechize it in a question-answer format. Now, I grew up with that. A few of us here grew up with it. Many of you don't know what I'm talking about, probably that you didn't grow up with it. But nonetheless, it had a lasting effect, because the difficulty with doing it that way was that the born of the Virgin Mary, the next article is suffered under Pontius Pilate. In other words, they left out his life. The Creed left out his life, and therefore the catechisms left out his life. There is no word in the Baltimore Catechism about the multiplication of the loaves and fishes, or his healing the sick, his restoring people to community, his outreach to the poor, the downtrodden, about not the stories about him, nor the stories he told, the Good Samaritan, the prodigal son, Lazarus at the gate last Sunday in the gospel reading. We grew up without it, and then we had a very limited series, a one-year cycle of readings in our liturgy. And of course, as good Catholics, we typically weren't reading our Bible. That was kind of a Protestant thing to be doing. Now, of course, we've been doing far better since Vatican II and so on. But I still think there's a huge lacuna in Catholic spirituality and it's waiting for, and that desperately needs the historical Jesus. And in many ways, I think this is what Ignatius did back in the 16th century, was to turn to the historical Jesus at a time when the church was obsessed with itself and with what was going on in the church, and understandably in the context of the time and so on, the revolt and the church falling apart. It was all about the church in large part. But Ignatius said, no, it has to be all about Jesus. And to look at the historical Jesus, to compose the place and to imagine you're there in the garden with him, seeing him sweat blood, and so on, to enter into that real historical person, who, of course, not denying Chalcedon or questioning anything, it was the Son of God, the second person of the Blessed Trinity, but it was God among us as one of ourselves in time and place. But that's to be the core, I think, of our renewed Catholic spirituality. The historical Jesus, and including, and again, not to fall into some kind of Christomonism, as if it's all just about me and Jesus, me and Jesus. We think Christomonism is dead. No, it's alive and well. Turn on your television any Sunday morning, and you'll see it there, promising wealth and prosperity. So it's not as if we're going to fall back just simply to Jesus, but Jesus has to be the canon within the canon of our spirituality. Has to be the one that lets us know who God is. Whoever sees me sees the Father. The role of the Spirit to continue God's saving work in Jesus. The role of the church in the world is to be the body of Christ and to continue God's ministry of God's reign in the midst of time and place, etc. So that I try throughout all of the chapters to tie in a hunger of the heart, indeed, and address that, but also with contemporary theology, but very often with a focus on Jesus. Years ago, I was privileged to be having a dinner one night, well, 5-6 years ago now, with Gustavo Gutierrez. I don't mean to be name-dropping. He's a dear friend of ours here at Boston College, has taught here many, many times. And he said to me over there, he said, Tom, he says, we all have to be evangelical. We have to become evangelical. The gospel has to be the center. And I remember thinking, well, isn't it already, Gustavo? Don't you think we're already doing that? But in a sense, he had a point that that we've given away the word evangelical, and in many ways the people in our society we think of as evangelical. I'm not sure, at least, and I don't watch them very often, but it's almost invariably the epistles. It's almost Paul is the Christ of faith will be the center of what they're preaching. But this character, the carpenter walking the roads of Galilee. So I do try to fill that in. Let me bring you back to the road to Emmaus, and I'm going to try a little bit of an experiment here. In many ways, and I've had people wonder about, well, are we reading too much into this text? And I put up this imaging because I'm going to ask you to imagine yourself being there in a moment. And if it helps, that's fine. If not, ignore it. And I like this imaging because it looks as if it's a man and a woman. And of course, that was very much the tradition of the early church, that Clopas of John, Mary, the wife of Clopas, in John 19:25, and then here is Cleopas, is the one who speaks. But at least in the early church, there was a strong tradition. There was a man and a woman that was on that road to Emmaus. Now, to make the point that I'm not trying to read into this text, although I'm terribly capable, I suppose, of doing that. I'm going to try to recite it as a narrative, and I'm going to use a number of different translations, weaving them together, and invite you to come along. But the point I want to make first is that in many ways, it was his whole approach is epitomized on the road to Emmaus. That beginning with people's lives, getting them to reflect on their lives, bringing them to the faith tradition and to the gospel of God's reign that he was preaching, in order for them to bring it back into their lives, that invitation, that discernment, coming to see for themselves and deciding then to become disciples. And so he begins by saying, the reign of God is like what? People sorting fish, people sowing seed, people looking for workers in a vineyard, the reign of God, and begins with people's own realidad, as it were, as we saw and referred earlier, began with their own life in the world, and got them to reflect upon it. Sometimes got them to break open a whole new consciousness, critique their old ways, and so the Samaritan becomes the neighbor, the prodigal is welcomed home, Lazarus went home to Abraham, etc., reversing people's mindset and getting them to think critically in many ways, to reflect on their life, to look at their life, to reflect on it. But then in the midst of that, preaching this good news of the reign of God in order to invite them to see for themselves, as he did on that road to Emmaus, and invite them into discipleship. It's the dynamic that runs through his whole public ministry. It's the dominant approach that you'll recognize in his public ministry. There are times when he even did it in one verse. And my favorite is Matthew 6:26, where he says to people, look at the birds of the air. Stop and look around you. Just take a look at the birds of the air. And then gets people to reflect on that. They neither reap nor sow, nor gather into barns. Look at your life, reflect on it. And then the instruction, or the faith. And yet your heavenly Father feeds them. And then the great appropriating, making it your own, seeing for yourself moment. He says, aren't you of more value than any sparrows? Life to faith to life. Let me invite you to sit back, relax a bit, let go books or copies or anything you might have, papers or anything like that. Take a few deep breaths. I'm going to stand away from the podium for a little bit. And as I said, I'm going to use a number of different translations, and it's more of a narrative of the text. The text begins by saying, that very same day. Now, the reference is to Easter Sunday. Two of the disciples, the reference is to the disciples, were making their way to a village named Emmaus, about 7 miles distance from Jerusalem, discussing as they went along all that had happened. Now let me invite you to join them on the road. And I'll pause for a moment for your composition of place. Imagine yourself joining their company, their lively exchange. Of course, it had to be traumatic exchange. So just join their company and prepare to walk along with them. And in the midst of their lively exchange, Jesus himself approached and began to walk along with them. That extraordinary active accompaniment joins their company to walk with them. Now, take a look at him. What does he look like to your imagination? What do you see when you look at him? Imagine him looking at you. What does he see? And now imagine that you exchange a look. You say something to each other, just with your eyes. What do you say to him? What does he say to you? And now he gives you a kind of a wink, much as to say, don't tell them. The text goes on. The text continues with, he says to them, what are you discussing as you go upon your way? What are you talking about? What's going on? What's your experience? And one of them, Cleophas by name, looking sad, turned to him and said, are you the only one who doesn't know the things that went on in Jerusalem these past few days? And he says to them, what things? Now you have to be amazed at that. I mean, nobody knew better than he went on in Jerusalem these past few days. So why is he asking these poor, distraught, traumatized disciples to name it, what they think went on? Which they proceed to do. They said all the things that had to do with Jesus of Nazareth, a prophet, powerful in the eyes of God and all the people, how our chief priest took him and had him crucified. We had been hoping. They've lost hope. We had been hoping he was the one who would set Israel free. Besides all this, some women of our group went to the tomb before dawn. They saw a vision of angels who declared he is alive. Some others of our group went to the tomb, some of the men, we presume, and but they saw nothing. Him they did not see. And he listens to it all and takes it all in and never says, oh, well, now comes a moment. He says to them, how foolish you are. How slow of heart, cardia. How slow of heart to believe all that the prophets had announced. Beginning then with Moses and all that the Messiah had to so suffer, so as to enter into his glory. And beginning then with Moses and all the prophets, he interpreted for them every passage of Scripture that referred to himself. No wonder you're on the road all day. The text says, by now they were near the village to which they were going, and he acts as if he's going on further, but they press him. They say, no, stay with us. The day is far spent. So he went in to stay with them. And you go in as well. And when you're all seated at the table, he takes the bread. And it's the exact same 4 verbs as at the Last Supper. He takes it, he blesses it, he breaks it, he gives it. And with that, their eyes are opened. And they recognize him. And it's epigenoson. It's that they were deeply bonded with him. They were united with him. They saw him, recognized him in the very deep heart's core of their lives. Whereupon he vanishes from their sight. Then they say to each other, the text we heard earlier, weren't our hearts burning inside of us? Really? When he talked to us upon the road and explained the Scriptures to us. And with that, they get up immediately. They've come to see for themselves. And if that happens in people's lives, then you can't just toddle on home and say, oh, wasn't that interesting? In a sense, they have to turn around and go back into Jerusalem and re-engage the faith community, their own faith. And when they go into the community in Jerusalem, they're greeted with, the Lord has been raised. It is true. He has appeared to Simon. I love the Jerusalem Bible translation of the last verse. It says, but then they told their story of what had happened on the road and how they'd come to know him in the breaking of the bread. Now, of course, it's a great liturgical passage with the liturgy of word on the road, the liturgy of Eucharist at the table. But it's a great pedagogical passage as well, with him bringing them to their own stories, their own shattered vision, setting up a dialectic. They were hoping for a political Messiah who would set Israel free. He says, no, the Messiah had to so suffer so as to enter into their glory. What are they going to do with that? How are they going to come to see for themselves? They go back into Jerusalem, and you've got to come on back home to Boston College. Let me bring you back into a few questions or that you might find helpful. Just very quietly, thinking to yourself, what did you come to see on the road to Emmaus? Or indeed, from any of the comments you've heard so far from Colleen, from Tom, from myself, what's emerging for you as a resource, and especially for your own spiritual journey? Could be an old idea revived, maybe a new horizon. But where are you invited spiritually by our reflections this evening? And what will be the wisdom or this for your own spiritual journey? Or for mentoring other people in their spiritual journey? And then, of course, if there's any answers or questions. But let me invite you back to the neighbor. I think time-wise we're doing very well. Go back to the neighbor, have a little chat. Respond to any of these questions if they engage you. Make up your own if they don't. What you're thinking, what you're coming to see for yourself. Give it 3 or 4 minutes with your neighbor, and then we'll hear 3 or 4 minutes of general comments, and then we'll be ready for our reception. So turn to a neighbor for a moment and have a chat. We'll regather and enjoy our nice reception very soon. Let me hear it just for 4 or 5 minutes. Thoughts, comments, insights, reflections, wisdoms that emerged, something you came to see for yourself, because I think that's always the clue and the key. That's the faith that we act upon. That's the faith that we go live in the world. When we come to recognize for ourselves, then it's our own. That's the spirituality of it all. But your comments, questions, answers, insights, wisdoms, or whatever. Brother John.
I think that in the little conversation we have, it's a question of the interactions we have, just like Jesus did, the one-on-one or the one-on-two, or our small groups. It's when the joy of our faith begins to catch on and we begin to move together.
Yes.
But it's not going to be in big groups. It's going to be in our life interactions, the very things you're talking about.
Yes. And in conversation, very often. And because when people start to name their own experience, Rahner's whole insistence that if we're going to be Christians in the future, we'll have to be mystics. But what's the source of the mystical? How does God come looking for us? Typically, through our own everyday lives and experiences in the world and in community and conversation. And of course, through the great tradition and the word, the biblical word handed down to us and so on. And yet integral to us coming to know for ourselves is that encounter, that experience. And then the naming of it and the reflecting on it and the hearing of other stories to enrich our own. I think you're on the ball, Brother John. Yourself in the pink. Good and loudly if you could. Andrea. Good and loudly, could you, Andrea? Just, yeah, we're really missing the microphones. Maybe stand? Thank you. Wonderful. It's a great question. Can we listen? Yeah, and hear, truly hear each other. Blessed are those who have the ears to hear, the eyes to see. And obviously he was talking about some kind of listening, like you're talking about, that it wasn't just physical sight or hearing, it was that listening of the heart. And I think it has to be a listening of the heart, that we listen to each other into holiness of life and into a wholeness of life. Yourself, Joe.
Something like that has been happening to all of us, and especially to the poor.
Yeah.
The reappropriation of the word, and as Francis calls it, the joy of the good news.
Yeah.
And what happened? Those two disciples, they were wrecked. They hadn't slept. They were
Heartbroken. Geez, their beloved Jesus crucified.
nothing left in the tank, and yet when he vanished, up they got and straight up the hill. No problem. Where do they get the energy? The joy of the good news.
Yeah. But as you said, the poor, I mean, you've spent a lifetime, Father Joe, I know for over 50 years, working in Peru. And the whole Comunidades de Base movement, it was about this, bringing poor peasant people. I remember one night in a group in Lima years ago, I was there visiting Gustavo, and it was clear that a number of people in the group weren't able to read. There were certain people who could read, and yet what they did, how they appropriated and interpreted the text and took it to heart and brought it into their lives was extraordinary. They were seeing things in the text that I'd never seen. Yeah, no clutter. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, good point. Another comment or two, maybe? I was thinking of Richard Dillon, a great scripture scholar. I'm sure many of our scripture scholars know him well. I believe he wrote his doctoral dissertation on this text, but I read a wonderful commentary by him on it some years ago, and I loved, he asked the question, where did he disappear to? Where did he go when he disappeared? He vanished from their sight. And Dillon says the only answer we can give is that he disappeared into them, into us, into the body of Christ. That we're the ones now that have to go and give the witness and be present to and help people see for themselves. But in a sense, I think it has to be the answer. Where did he disappear? He disappeared to another Emmaus road. Hopefully he came to Boston College even this evening. So there's lots of play. But in a sense, it's into us that that have to keep this. And I think the style, the approach, the way he went about it, we can't just imitate him slavishly or something, or I'm not proposing that at all, or to absolutize it or something. But but it's very resonant with the exercises. Those of us who've done the exercises and been through the 30-day retreat, I mean, it's basically life to faith, to life in faith. So for our new program, that it's such an amazing moment for us to claim this and to center this at the heart and soul of our school. It's such a marvelous moment and opportunity. But I think this is the kind of spirituality and the kind of style or approach to it all that we have to be about. Let me take one more comment. Please. Carlotta, nobody better to give the last word.
Person that breaks bread with other people along the way.
Yes.
Their hearts are on fire. I think we have to keep ourselves on fire.
Hear, hear.
Be a witness to Jesus.
Hear, hear. Very good. Wonderful, Caroline. Thank you so much. Marvelous and a lovely reception awaits us. Thank you, thank you.